Good morning, Tokyo time. I'm very happy to have been asked to give this keynote address, and I only wish we were all together in person in Tokyo. I'm C.Brinton, and the title of my talk is Social Norms as Mechanisms in Reproducing Inequality. I sometimes think of social norms as the neglected stepchild in the discipline of sociology. Of course, this was not always the case. Sociology's classical theorists, and of course the functionalists of 1950s era American sociology, were keenly interested in norms. But with the conceptualization of norms by Talcott Parsons and other functional sociologists as being embodied in socialization processes, norms generally tumbled out of favor among American sociologists when functionalism did. One might have thought that among the plethora of American sociology's substantive factions and tribes, the sociology of culture would have been a likely landing spot for the study of norms. But that does not seem to have been the case. Rather, cultural sociologists have focused greater attention on cultural schema, cultural frames, and cultural processes such as classification and recognition that define the self and direct interaction. Norms rarely appear in the cultural sociologist's lexicon. Nevertheless, both the emergence of social norms and their durability remain central subjects of profound importance in sociology and in the social sciences in general. In Michael Hector and Carl Dieter Opp's jointly edited volume on social norms, which appeared in 2001, scholars from a variety of disciplines offered their definitions of norms and their theoretical perspectives on the emergence of norms. Hector and Opp, in their opening chapter, posited two definitions of social norms. The first is norms as moral imperatives, what they term oughtness norms. The second definition of norm is behavioral regularities that generate social expectations without any moral obligations. From this point of view, we identify certain behavior as a social norm if deviation from that practice results in costs being imposed on an agent. They term these regularity norms, and it is this latter type of norm with which I am concerned today. I'd like to preface my remarks by mentioning that it may have been predetermined that as a sociologist, I developed a keen intellectual interest in social norms. Michael Hector was my mentor in graduate school. Then, when I was in my first job at the University of Chicago, Jim Coleman became my mentor. But a third reason that I was probably predestined to be fascinated with social norms, and this is a reason that predated my acquaintance with either Michael Hector or Jim Coleman, was that from the age of 20 or so, I became fascinated with Japanese society. To comprehend much of anything regarding social relations, the maintenance of social order, and the durability of status hierarchies and inequality in Japan, one has to recognize the strength of social norms and the reinforcement of norms through various institutions that pervade everyday life in contemporary Japan. Over the years, I have come to see that my own area of substantive expertise, gender inequality, absolutely demands an understanding of how social norms in gender relations have been maintained over time and have created a durable inequality. The title of my talk refers to how norms contribute to gender inequality, although that theme will only appear in the second of two concrete examples of regularity norms that I will be discussing later in the talk. My focus today is not the emergence of norms, the persistence of norms. One sociologist of culture who has recognized the importance of persistence is my colleague, Orlando Patterson. Patterson points out that the literature on stability and persistence in sociology is mainly focused on structural and organizational stability, rather than cultural reproduction or persistence. But, he argues, we need to understand continuity, not only in its own right, but because a proper understanding of change itself is not possible without knowledge of the process of persistence against which it is measured. The persistence of some regularity norms, I will argue, is beneficial for the collective, but the persistence of others produces arguably undesirable outcomes for the individual and for the collective. The two examples I will discuss in this talk include one instance where the regularity norm arguably does benefit the collective, and one instance where it does not. My question in the talk is, why do some regularity norms persist even when they produce arguably undesirable outcomes for the collective and perhaps also for the individual? Now, before I proceed further, I want to also mention the two types of norm enforcement mechanisms. First are, of course, internalized social norms. As Michael Hector points out, this mechanism is consistent with an individual values-based explanation. The second type of norm enforcement is, of course, in external sanctions, the rewards for conforming to a norm and the negative sanctioning for actions contrary to a norm. And these types of norms enforcement will become important later. So, getting to my two concrete examples of regularity norms in contemporary Japanese society. Example number one is the persistence of a beneficial social norm, and that is mask wearing in the age of COVID-19. A study by Nakayachi et al. In late March of 2020 inquired as to why Japanese people were so nearly uniform in putting on masks after the COVID-19 crisis emerged. They asked, why do so many Japanese people wear masks, despite the fact that masks provide little protection against becoming infected with COVID-19? What the authors did was to survey a random sample of Japanese adults and asked a series of questions to these adults. First, they asked about the frequency of mask wearing, and then they asked a number of questions about beliefs. They asked about the belief about the severity of COVID-19 if you were to have the disease. Beliefs about the efficacy of wearing a mask, both in terms of self-protection and in terms of wearing a mask for preventing the spread of COVID-19. They then asked about the perceived norm of mask wearing by stating, when you see other people wearing masks, do you think that you should wear a mask? Next, they asked about relief from anxiety. Do you think that you can ease your anxiety by wearing a mask? And finally, they asked about the impulse to take an action, whatever action is necessary or possible. In other words, do you think you should do whatever you can to avoid COVID-19? So they wondered if that was also perhaps a motivation for mask. The self-reported frequency of wearing a mask was, not surprisingly, very impressive. So about 50% of the adults in this survey said that they usually wear a mask, and another 30% said that they sometimes wear a mask. Mask usage was found to be strongly correlated with the perception of norms, i.e., participants' affirmative answer to, when you see other people wearing masks, do you think that you should wear a mask? Secondarily, there was a strong correlation with feeling relief from anxiety when wearing a mask. In contrast, there were no significant correlations with perceived severity of COVID-19 or with the impulse to take any action necessary to avoid the disease, and no significant correlations with participants' belief in the efficacy of masks in either reducing infection risk for themselves or infection risk for other people. Let me now turn to example number 2. And this is an example of when the persistence of a social norm does not produce collective benefits and may not be producing individual benefits either. Here I look at the case of very low paternity leave usage in Japan. Paternity leave is one of many policies the Japanese government has been promoting in order to raise Japan's very low birth rate. The provisions of paternity leave in Japan are very generous, even in international terms, but the usage rates are extreme. Former Prime Minister Abe's administration set a goal of doubling the proportion of Japanese men who take parental leave by 2020, hoping to raise it to 13%. The current goal, as of 2021 in the new administration, is to raise it to 30% by 2025. The percentage of men taking paternity leave has indeed doubled over the past few years, but it's doubled from just 3% to 7% of eligible Japanese male employees. And among those 7%, over 70% take less than leave. There exists a large body of comparative research on the effects of men taking paternity leave. These studies are, of course, mainly done in Europe, since we don't have statutory paternity leave in the United States. And some of the positive effects reported by these studies are benefits for new mothers' physical and psychological welfare, benefits for the father-child bond, a positive effect on a couple's probability of having a second child, which is what the Japanese government is counting on in promoting paternity leave, and a positive effect on gender equality by helping women return to the workplace sooner than they would have been able to if their husband did not take paternity leave. So that is considered the positive effect on gender equality of paternity leave. Now, opinion surveys in Japan vary in terms of the proportion of men they find stating that they would like to take paternity leave. But many studies find that at least half of men say they would like to do this. The figure is much higher among young, newly hired employees. A recent Japanese government survey on the perceived difficulty ease of raising children in various countries was conducted and reported on a few weeks ago. Respondents to this survey were a random sample of individuals aged 20 to 49 in each of the countries surveyed. And I show this as an indication of the perceptions across the Japanese population of the difficulty or ease of raising children in the country. In the pie charts I'll show, light blue represents the percentage of people aged 20 to 49 who agree with the statement, it is difficult to raise children in this country. Perhaps unsurprisingly, only 3% of Swedes agree with that statement. The percentage is somewhat larger in France and slightly larger again in Germany. However, the percentage of people say that it is difficult to raise children in this country is well over 50% in Japan. Much different, qualitatively different from the other countries. So this is yet another argument, quite possibly, for the value of paternity. So the question is, why does the norm of not taking paternity leave persist in Japan? In my research on gender role attitudes, family formation, and work and life balance, I conducted an initial interview and a follow-up interview 8 years later. But the initial interview was in 2012 with highly educated men and women in large urban centers in Japan, age 24 to 35. And the following questions were asked at the end of the interview. It was a highly structured interview conducted, of course, entirely in Japanese, by two female Japanese interviewers that I personally trained. At the end of the interview, people were asked, in general, what do you think of working mothers taking parental leave? And how about fathers taking parental leave? This was followed by these questions. Do you yourself think you will take parental leave in the future if you have a child? Why or why not? What are the considerations you will have in mind in deciding this? So again, these questions were asked of both men and less than 1/2 of interviewees felt positively about the idea of men taking paternity leave. Slightly fewer men felt positively than women did. And there were 4 principal reasons men and women expressed for opposing paternity leave. The first was loss of income to the household, and this is because wage compensation during paternity leave is not 100% or even 90%. And this is disadvantageous given the large male-female wage gap. So it's more rational for the female only to take maternity leave and child care leave, because her wages are almost always lower than the man's wages. Second, both men and women expressed the fear that men's careers will be disrupted and damaged if they take paternity leave. Third, many people mentioned that no other men in the workplace had taken leave, and they therefore expressed a fear of stigmatization. Men expressed this, women expressed it for their husbands. And finally, the 4th reason given was it would cause trouble for one's colleagues. So again, these reasons came out of the open-ended question about asking people the reasons for their beliefs about paternity leave. Now note that 3 of these have to do with the workplace, and 1 has to do with the loss of income that would be incurred to the household, and none have to do with really anything related to family dynamics per se. So let me give some examples of what people told us, and obviously these have been translated into English. Hitoshi said, in addition to not knowing anyone in my company who has taken it, there's absolutely no culture in Japan as a whole for men to take child care leave, and there's no place to plant such an idea. Keita was another example. I think it would be good if fathers take paternity leave, but I doubt it's possible. The interviewer then asked why he felt that way, and Keita said, it's impossible. Why? Because no one takes it. Emiko, a married woman, replied when we asked her these questions, I think it's fine for fathers to take child care leave, but at my company there isn't a single man who has taken it. I think there would be consequences for it. And the 4th reason that people expressed some disapproval or fear about paternity leave was they worried that it would cause trouble for the male employees' colleagues. So Yutaka said, it would be good taking paternity leave if I could make arrangements with my colleagues about my work. I wouldn't want to cause any inconvenience at work. And Takayuki said, I would need to make preparations so that I don't inconvenience people. Let's say there are 200 tasks to do. If I take time off, those will go to other people, so it inconvenience them. So why is mask wearing so easy and taking paternity leave so impossible? Well, the easy answer, of course, is that wearing a mask is relatively costless. Also, it is simply the application of an existing regularity norm to the novel event of COVID-19. Japanese people, and in fact, people in East Asian countries in general, are used to routinely wearing masks when they have a cold or the flu. And so it's not at all an uncommon sight to see people getting on the train or walking down the street with a mask on. This norm was extended to the case of COVID-19. Okay, but what really makes taking paternity leave so costly? Also, why hasn't the government's promotion of paternity leave been effective? My answer is the following. The Japanese government's attempts to promote paternity leave have focused mainly on changing the attitudes of individual men. And part of this is the Ikumen campaign that began in 2010 on the part of the government. So promoting an image of sexy, fashionable young Japanese fathers taking paternity leave and spending time with their children. And this really encouraged men to internalize the norm of taking paternity leave to become active fathers. I think really this was an effort on the part of the Japanese government, not a conscious effort, but an effort to make a new oughtness norm, a moral imperative, rather than treating non-leave taking as a regularity norm that needs to be changed. A second approach taken by the Japanese government has been to incentivize companies to report a higher number of male employees who take paternity leave. But I've put red minus signs beside each of these government attempts. Why? Because they have not worked at all. And I think incentivizing companies follows the same mistaken logic as trying to change the attitudes of individual men. In other words, trying to persuade a man or a company to do the right thing. Government promotion of paternity leave, to my mind, has failed because the main reasons men don't take leave are due to social relations in the workplace. The economic incentive could be increased, for sure, and greater wage compensation during paternity leave might encourage more men to take leave, but I do not think it would get at the fundamental reasons men don't take leave. And here I want to turn to an insight from Christine Horn, who said, understanding the role of social relations is essential for explaining meta-norm and norm enforcement. Horn points out that actions that have greater effects on others may be more subject to sanctioning than actions that create only minimal externalities. For this reason, she argues that it is important to look at the extent of interdependence in a group in order to understand how norms are enforced. And this has direct application to the Japanese workplace. Government efforts have not dislodged the persistence of the regularity norm that men don't take paternity leave. And the norm persists because of the structure of external negative sanctions exercised through social relations in the workplace, not because of mistaken internalized norms that men hold. In terms of the negative sanctions, there are two main negative sanctions I see going on in the workplace. And one is the discretionary control of valued resources, such as wage increases and promotions, by people higher up in the company hierarchy. These high-level managers can exert negative material sanctions on male employees who break the norm by taking paternal leave. And there have been several high-profile cases in the Japanese media of patahara, or paternity harassment, which often involves the invocation of such negative sanctions against men who took paternity leave. Second, think about what people said about not wanting to cause trouble for their coworkers, or meiwaku o kakeru, causing trouble in Japanese. The structure and organization of work in most Japanese workplaces is such that paternity leave easily leads to the disruption of a man's relationships with his coworkers. So think about the comments that I quoted, where men said they would have to arrange things before they go on paternity leave, and they worry that their coworkers would kind of be left in the lurch. So men fear retaliation if they break the social norm of not taking paternity leave. In conclusion, I've illustrated how the staying power of a regulatory norm can address a new social problem, COVID-19, through the extension of an existing behavior, mask wearing. And conversely, I've illustrated that a regulatory norm, even if it is not necessarily producing positive outcomes at either the individual or the collective level, in the case of paternity leave, can persist unless the key external negative sanctions for breaking the norm are understood and addressed by policy. Thank you so much.